Yeah, I think we can start. It's exactly 5 p.m. in Sofia. It's 4 p.m. in Brussels and 10 p.m. in 10 a.m. in DC. Welcome everyone to this online policy conference on the Chinese economic influence in Europe, the governance and climate conundrum. My name is Ruslan Stefanov, and I'm the program director at CSD, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this interesting discussion today. Let me just start with several house cleaning and keeping rules. Number one, this is a recorded session. It is on record. So please note this. You should have received a message when joining. We will be starting the panel soon. Just wanted to let you know that we will put some rules of engagement in the chat box so you could see them. We will also provide a link to the report that we're presenting today. And also, if you would like to take part in the discussion after the panel, please raise your hand so that I could see, or just put your question in the Q&A box. I think we already, everybody knows the drill already. If you also need any of the assistance of my colleagues, please make sure to write in the chat box. So for any questions in this discussion, the Q&A box, and for any questions towards the organizers in the chat box. Thank you very much for everybody joining us. Now, I will start with a few questions that we would like to raise and discuss in today's events. As you know, CSD has been working on the foreign economic influence in Europe for a number of years. We've been focusing on Russia, but it's clear more and more that China is also falling in the same line. We prepared, thanks to the support from the European Climate Foundation, this report that my colleague Martin Vladimirev will be presenting in a few minutes. I would like to thank it was a whole bunch of people helping us prepare this, but I would like to thank also specifically Dr. Mirza Kushlugic from Tuzla, Dr. Martin Hala from Charles University, and Petar Kreko from Political Capital in Hungary for providing their input. I'm not mentioning also many other people including from our partners from SIPE, but Eric is going to speak here today. So Eric Honso, Center for International Private Enterprise, we've done a lot on corrosive capital and how economic influence can turn into political influence. We're of course very much interested in the region of Central and Eastern Europe and in on the position of Europe. In that respect, we think that we have to ask three questions. Number one, why China? Well, clearly we're in a renewed kind of global competition of powers, and China is going to play a critical role if even recent events are some indication. Looking at what's happening in Afghanistan, clearly China is seen as some sort of a counterbalancing force, and Europe and the US and NATO countries are on the other side. Now, we're very interested also in this particular region because looking at the history of the Western Balkans in particular, but also the wider Central and Eastern Europe region, we've seen that Russia has been very active in trying to challenge the economic, social, and political orientations of these countries. But also China. Although China says that it supports the integration of Central and Eastern Europe, and in particular the Western Balkans, into Europe, we beg to differ. And one of the specific areas that we will be covering in the report today is environment. We think that actually the investment in coal says another thing. So the Chinese are just paying lip service, but in the end of the day, their investment in coal in the Western Balkans are actually going in the completely opposite direction to what Europe stands for. So I think the next strategic clash that we're going to see is going to be actually in the Western Balkans. And we also have reasons to believe from our work on the Kremlin playbook that Russia is going to try to use this and infuse itself additionally in in this debate. So we have all reasons to worry that we are going to see a lot of different debates on specifically on the Western Balkans, just like we saw on the vaccine diplomacy or the vaccine debates, with a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and all the different tools. So today we will be specifically interested to hear from our great panel, and which includes the member of European Parliament, Rajka Beautykofer, from the Greens, who have been one of the most active in designing new policies and actually trying to tackle these competition, you call it, or opposition to China. We'll see how this is going to be decided. We have also Ruben Diaz-Playa from Nato, from the policy planning office. Thanks for joining us. And Eric Hons will finish this great panel. He's from the Center for International Private Enterprise, the Deputy Regional Director on Europe and Eurasia. But I will now start and give the floor with my colleague Martin Vladimirov, who is the Director Climate and Energy at CSD, and who managed and led the preparation of our latest report for him to present the main findings. Martin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, and thank you all for joining our presentation today. I would like to ask my colleague Marietta to switch on my PowerPoint presentation, please. Marietta, if you could, okay, great, thank you. So today, I'll try to really briefly present the key findings from our Chinese economic influence in Europe report by focusing on the results from the Chinese Economic Power Index that we tried to create over the past 12 months. In the end, I would also try to introduce some key policy takeaways for EU and US policymakers, and we'll try to give some ideas on how to counter malign authoritarian influence in general, not only from China, but also from other players interested in penetrating strategic sectors of Southeast Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. To start off, it is important to point out in general that China's presence in Europe has been gaining momentum over the last decade. Beijing has really increased its influence at the backdrop of a renewed global power competition and a series of structural crises in the EU. China has engaged differentially with European regions. And in the case of Central and Eastern Europe, it has launched the 17+1 initiative, which includes all former communist countries plus Greece. In addition, it has leveraged its Belt and Road initiative as a powerful geopolitical tool for the penetration of Chinese capital in the region. Next slide, please. To study the true extent of the Chinese economic influence, CSD developed a composite index, which is based on comparative macroeconomic, corporate, environmental, and other trade data. The idea is to merge this data with an expert assessment of key governance deficits, so to judge and evaluate the real impact of the Chinese economic presence on governance, the environment, and climate policy. We have looked at three main pillars of this comparative assessment. First, structural economic ties, the development of trade, investment, and corporate ties, with a focus on the potential amplifying effects of the Chinese economic influence on climate-related sectors, such as energy, transportation, and heavy industry, which have been excessively dependent on Chinese capital and markets in the recent decade. The second pillar we looked at is climate more specifically. So what is the climate impact from the increased Chinese investments and financial flows to the region? This was done by a qualitative assessment of large-scale projects and the impact of these projects on government climate policies, the implementation of EU and national technical and environmental standards, as well as a combination of a quantitative review of the actual impact of Chinese projects and investments on the level of greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and environmental degradation. Last but not least, we looked at the governance impact, so the quality of governance and how it is influenced by Chinese presence. We tried to assess the ability of China to lock national governments in the region into long-term infrastructure projects based on intergovernmental agreements or other cooperation instruments. A specific focus has been put on the risk of a debt trap that Chinese projects are representing for some of the countries, especially in the Western Balkans. Next slide, please. So the comparative assessment of the Chinese economic influence is based on 3 sub-indices. One is Chinese Economic Footprint Index, which is the quantitative evaluation of trade, financial ties, and corporate presence. Then you have the Index of Environmental and Climate Impact in Central and Eastern Europe, and finally the Index of the Chinese Influence on Governance and Strategic Policy. We'll start off with the economic variables. As you can see on this graph, China has increased its economic influence, so the share of the economy that is directly or indirectly influenced by China, from just 0.46% in 2009 to 1.25% in 2019. This regional average masks a significant divergence between the countries. For example, Czechia, Hungary, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina have seen the biggest increase in the Chinese economic footprint, up to 3–4% of the economy. China has also become the single largest trading partner in the region, even though it is not a major export market for many of these countries. Hence, most of the kind of economic involvement is unidirectional. So these countries importing goods, and mostly goods, but also services from China. Next slide, please. Since 2009, we have seen that around $14 billion in Chinese funds have entered the region in the form of grants, loans, mergers and acquisitions, as well as concessions. Chinese investments in Central and Eastern Europe have been focused in a few key sectors. We have all heard of the large transportation projects, energy, manufacturing, and telecommunications. We have seen close to 10,000 new firms registered in the region with Chinese ultimate beneficial ownership, and around $50 billion worth of projects which are either under construction or in the pipeline. It is important, of course, to clarify that many of these projects have been delayed, are running with significant problems. There are cost overruns, delays. Some of these projects are still at the phase of a memorandum of understanding and might not be actually realized, but we have seen that China overall delivers on many of its objectives, economic objectives, and it engages even in projects that seem illogical or economically non-feasible. The reason why these numbers are poignant is that China, in a matter of a decade, has basically filled a growing vacuum, economic and political vacuum left by the EU and the US in the region. It seems that because China does not use strings to lure countries into intergovernmental agreements and projects, it has become much more successful than EU and US initiatives, specifically on large-scale infrastructure projects, specifically on energy. This has been particularly true in the Western Balkans, where local governments have prioritized non-EU deals as a way of loosening governance conditionalities and as a way to channel funds to local oligarchic networks. Next slide, please. Moving on to the environmental impact, it is important to know that Chinese-driven projects face one key similarity, which is the disregard for the country's environmental policy and the environmental feasibility of some of these initiatives. Chinese projects contribute to a policy lock-in that basically push governments to abandon decarbonization objectives and make them continue prioritize the exploitation of carbon-intensive industries, including coal-fired power generation, but also heavy metallurgy, A case in point has been the acquisition of the Smederevo steel plant in Serbia, or the Bor mining plant again in Serbia. These projects and also acquisitions undermine the 2030 and 2050 targets of EU member states on the one hand, or the energy and climate acquis of the 6 EU candidate countries in the Western Balkans. It is important to analyze the environmental impact of the Chinese presence in the region, both qualitatively, looking into specific projects and specific governance deficits, but also quantitatively by seeing whether the Chinese economic presence has had a negative impact on the level of greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, and environmental degradation. As you can see on this graph, basically there has been a 50% increase of the negative environmental impact in the region on average, partially because of the growing Chinese economic presence, but also due to a number of associated structural factors, including economic growth that is based on carbon-intensive industries, low energy efficiency, and in general, low environmental standards associated with large-scale projects. The deterioration of environmental indicators comes despite the overall improvement in climate policy, in energy policy, especially in EU countries, in EU member states. Next slide, please. We can see that probably the main negative effect on decarbonization of the Chinese economic presence is that China has allowed coal power plants to be upgraded and to be sustained. So you can see on this graph that there is a positive, although weak, correlation between the rising Chinese financial flows to the region and the share of coal-fired power generation in the electricity mix. China has made sure that countries, especially in the Western Balkans, are not phasing out coal and will be locked in this dependence for the foreseeable future. We actually expect this correlation to grow stronger in the future when many of the ongoing Chinese coal refurbishment projects come online actually in the early 2020s. Next slide, please. Finally, in the third pillar of our Chinese Economic Power Index, we try to map the diplomatic tools and the governance mechanisms exploited by China to expand its influence in Central and Eastern Europe. This third sub-index gathers the expert assessment from a comprehensive survey of national experts, diplomats, and policymakers in each country on how Chinese economic power has translated into political leverage. This index analyzes whether China is able to promote its strategic economic objectives successfully and whether Beijing takes advantage of local governance deficits to expand its economic influence. Whether this presence has a negative impact on the country's energy and climate policy, on the other hand. Basically, we try to understand how China exploits existing governance deficits and entrenches them further by taking advantage, for example, of local oligarchic networks. We can see that the rising Chinese economic footprint since 2009 has coincided with a deterioration of these same governance standards. So the adverse effect seems to be most visible and strongest in Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Montenegro. On the EU side, Hungary has been the prime example. National governments have provided Chinese contractors with preferential treatment and state aid in the form of tax exemptions and the circumvention of labor standards. China has also learned how to tap into EU regional funds for infrastructure. By 2020, Chinese companies have doubled the amount of EU-based contracts secured in the region to nearly 2 billion euros. The Pelješac Bridge in Croatia is probably the most prominent case in which a Chinese company basically was able to beat all of the Western competition and take advantage of EU funds to execute the project. Next slide, please. This trend is very visible in the graph on this slide. It is obvious that there is a positive correlation between the Chinese financial flows and a negative impact on governance. It seems, from the graph at least, that the more indebted a country has been to China relative to its GDP, the higher the likelihood that China has leveraged its existing governance deficits. The Western Balkans, as I mentioned, are the most vulnerable, and Bosnia and Herzegovina are real outliers, as you can see. They are the weakest links. We believe that Chinese loans have been able to tap into basically a lack of transparency and competition, and lack of consistency with EU laws, especially on the environment, on technical standardization. In many cases, Chinese direct lending covers 85% of the project capital costs, while the remainder is financed by the host countries. For countries like Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, Chinese-led projects make up around a quarter or a fifth of the country's GDP. This makes Chinese economic presence a structurally indispensable factor and can be used in the future as a leverage for pressuring governments in changing their strategic policy or foreign policy orientation. On average, in the whole region and in the country that we looked at, the region, Chinese projects and the loans attached to these projects are estimated at 5.6% of GDP, which is significantly more than, for example, the exposure to EU funding or Western funding in general. Slide 9. Chinese projects also carry a number of governance risks. We have seen and we have analyzed in our work a number of initiatives financed by the Belt and Road program, whereas basically projects are implemented entirely by loans from Chinese development and export banks. But these loans are dispersed as a direct outcome of very obscure intergovernmental agreements that have not been discussed previously in the public, or there have been no feasibility assessments on how this product will be implemented and whether they are actually profit-making. In some countries, actually, the intergovernmental agreements are exempt projects from national competition, public procurement, or import tariffs. Sometimes these agreements can also be preceded by a specific ad hoc legislation that justifies the country's involvement in the specific projects. Not to mention that in many cases, these projects are directly supported by state capture networks, domestic state capture networks, especially in the Western Balkans, that would definitely benefit from the agreements in the future. These local companies do not necessarily depend on China for exports, for imports of raw materials, or any direct financing, but they position themselves as key intermediaries, as bridges between China and local governments. As they control, in many cases, or have tried to capture key institutions in these countries, they can provide security for China that the projects will be implemented despite the inconsistencies with the legal and regulatory framework. Next slide, please. 1 minute,
Martin.
Yes.
Thank you.
So what can be done to counter the negative impact of Chinese economic influence? There are many policy suggestions in the report, but probably most importantly, there is a need for a robust US and EU response, which uses a range of economic tools for establishing the foundation of a new economic formula for a new economic development. This needs to be combined with the enforcement of EU-wide governance standards and real screenings for Chinese investments. At the same time, the EU should reinforce its position as the primary driver of economic development by filling the funding gap for the implementation of strategic projects like highways, transportation corridors in general, modernization of energy grids, and the kickstarting of energy transition investments, renewable energy, energy efficiency. On the other hand, the US, through the Free Seas initiative, can also become an effective mechanism to attract Western capital. This capital can have a constructive effect on the overall market and governance environment in the region. More intricately and more specifically, I would say that there is a need to empower the energy community as a key institution for the implementation of EU energy and climate acquis, and as a way to prevent environmentally harmful Chinese projects like coal-fired power plants to be implemented. Last but not least, in the end of the day, as we have always argued, it's about us. It's about closing governance loopholes within these countries. So governments need to work on strengthening institutions, and they need to start conducting a more thorough assessments of the large-scale projects that they are diving into, so that they are compliant with intergovernmental agreements and with, in general, with the EU and national legal framework. And with this, I would like to close my presentation. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. I would like to remind our participants that they could pose questions in the Q&A box, or later on in the discussion, they could raise their hand and ask questions. Now, it's my pleasure to turn over to the member of European Parliament, Reinhard Bütikofer, with whom we've long discussed different issues. Also, the green future of Europe. He's from the group of European Greens, the European Free Alliance, and he's chair of the delegation for relations with the People's Republic of China in the European Parliament. And also, he was recently blacklisted by China as a retaliation for Europe's stance on human rights in China. Mr. Bütikofer, it is my utmost pleasure to hear from you, and we're looking forward to see the answers. I mean, we do feel that we're going to see a showdown in the Western Balkans, and it seems that it's coming. How should Europe respond? Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stefanov, for having me. Thanks to CSD for putting this on, and thanks to Mr. Vladimirov for his presentation. I believe that, as he rightfully argued, the relative success of China in penetrating this part of our European subcontinent comes in the wake of our European failures. The gaps, the fissures, the contradictions, and the holes that they make use of are the gaps and fissures that we allowed to persist. So I think China is not thriving as a power that tries to gain a foothold because of the overwhelming attractiveness of its governance model, or the overall attractiveness of the collaboration. We've seen in most European countries that public opinion has grown very critical of China, regardless of the level of economic involvement. But China is sometimes seen as an actor by default, as a partner by default. And that is also the case, by the way, in other parts of the globe, where China's Belt and Road initiatives may be viewed suspiciously, but people then say, well, before I voice publicly my criticism, give me an alternative. And I think the same applies here. What I would contradict, if you allow me, is this notion, I would call it a myth, that China's investment comes without strings attached. I don't believe this is the case. We've seen studies recently of more than 100 loan contracts that China signed with other nations, particularly in Africa, but similar principles apply elsewhere, where you see that they do attach strings, just in a different way. There is no human rights conditionality, there is no sustainability conditionality, but there is a China friendliness conditionality. And I think we should not overlook that. I believe that overall the level of China's investment is still pretty low. The country with the highest quote unquote dependency among the countries that you have studied was the Czech Republic, with just about 3.5% of GDP. In Germany, a much bigger country, the level of economic interrelationship is much stronger. It's more than twice that amount. 8% of our exports roughly go to China. And Chinese investment going to Germany, going to France, going to the UK is much more focused and much more impactful than investment going to the countries of the Western Balkans and the 17+1 region. So I would say that it is good to wake up. It is good to take note, but this is by no means a stage of development where it would be extremely difficult to return, to change, to turn around, to reverse the tide. And I think there are several levels on which we can act, and I would just want to name a few. One is, I believe that the 17+1 countries could make use of the 17+1 as a tool that would strengthen them together, as long as they don't follow Lithuania's lead. I sympathize with Lithuania's decision to leave the 17+1, but as long as other countries do not make up their minds to go in the same direction, at least what they could do and what they should do would be to act as 16 or 17 or how many ever they are. What the experience has been in the past is that the 16 or 17 were all sort of acting on their own, and the only cohesive factor was the Chinese-dominated secretariat that produced the conclusions. I think by cooperating more strongly, by preparing the exchanges, together with the support of the European Commission, they could play a much stronger role vis-a-vis China. That is one dimension that I would want to mention. Secondly, we're presently working a lot within the European Union on strengthening Europe's trade defense instruments. And I believe that this will be of utmost relevancy for all the member states and all the candidate countries. We've seen China trying to use economic ties for coercive purposes. In the case of the Czech Republic, in the case of Sweden, Norway, Australia, many other countries. So this has led us to the conclusion that we need an anti-coercion instrument. China is rigging economic competition by not following WTO rules on public subsidies. This is why we now pursue an anti-subsidy instrument in the European Union. China has promised to open its procurement markets 17 times since they joined WTO 20 years ago, and they never moved 1 inch. Now it is time to create a European international procurement instrument to push for reciprocity. And also we're looking at human rights due diligence mechanism that would hopefully include a mechanism to exclude products of forced labor from the European internal market. So I think with these instruments, we're strengthening our backbone, we're strengthening our economic leverage. I do agree with the conclusions from Mr. Vladimirov when he emphasized the need for more European investment. This has been part of the latest decision of the Council on a new strategy together with a new methodology for accession talks to provide more investment. I think this has to be pursued. And I also agree wholeheartedly with the 3Cs initiative. And I see a third dimension which might be useful. We have been pursuing the idea of creating a kind of a European alternative to the BRI. We've called that the European Connectivity Strategy. So far, we haven't gone far with that. But now this agenda is taking hold. The President of the European Commission will make it an important part of her State of the Union address later this month. The President of the Council has come forward in support of this agenda. Many players do that. And by aligning themselves with the connectivity strategy of the European Union, countries in the region could also benefit a lot. And there's a last dimension that I want to mention that Mr. Vladimirov did not mention, and that is indeed civil society. And I give you the example of coal energy investment. The first time I was confronted with the problems of Chinese financed exports of Chinese fossil technology to the Western Balkans was when people from environmental NGOs approached me to raise the issue with me. And I think we should invest into supporting and enhancing the capability of civil society organizations to play a role also as valiant critics of China's influence. And I think this would this would add to a comprehensive approach that we should all invest into. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reinhard, for bringing all these really excellent points. I think we could have saved this for discussion. I also count CSD to one of those civil society organizations that are looking into the matters, in particular as they relate to the Western Balkans. I would like now to turn to Ruben Diaz-Playa, who is the Senior Project Advisor, Policy Planning at the Office of the Secretary General of NATO. Ruben, if you could squeeze out in 5 minutes so that we could go to Eric and have a discussion. I think what we are seeing with in the Western Balkans in terms of disinformation with the vaccine diplomacy, with the migrant crisis now, with the use of Belarus, with the interplay between China and Russia, and there's been a lot of strategizing in China and in Russia, of course, in their strategy in terms of removing the common kind of political infrastructure of the West and trying to handle countries one by one. I wonder where NATO stands on this, and how do you see cooperation and strengthening our Southeast European flank? Thanks for joining us. Ruben, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ruslan, and thank you to the whole CSD for inviting me to this presentation, to this conference today, and to be able to comment a little bit on this fascinating piece of work that your organization has put out. And thanks to Martin also for that. So I think, answering your question, I approach it very much from the point of view of the transatlantic relationship and how all these issues that you discussed today relate back to what NATO is discussing at the moment, to how our NATO agenda is evolving. And what I find so fascinating, I think, from your approach, your analysis, is first of all just the method of it. That I find it really bold and pioneering in the way that you trace the links between a set of core strategic challenges that we face in Europe and beyond in a very provocative and original way. You bring together geopolitical competition, the challenge of societal and state resilience, energy security, but also the opportunities and challenges of tackling the climate crisis. You're doing this in a very intersectional way, to use a buzzword of this day. And you're looking at a big question of, how can we tackle and fight climate change whilst at the same time being lucid about the realities of geopolitical competition. So my compliments to you for that. So to answer your question, Ruslan, I think all the subjects that you've mentioned, all the subjects that you've discussed in the presentation so far are of high relevance to NATO and the transatlantic agenda at the moment. China, resilience, technological innovation, and climate change were at the heart of our recent summit in Brussels in June, including through the adoption of a bit ambitious package of decisions you may have heard of, NATO 2030. And so I think there are very big connections to be drawn to those four elements of the agenda that I just outlined. And one big implication with regards to what you said about our common political infrastructure. So first of all, on China, I think it's clear that allied leaders agree that the rise of China is a defining issue for the transatlantic community at this moment, with potential consequences for our security, our prosperity, and our way of life. We don't see NATO China as an adversary. We see opportunities to engage on issues such as arms control and climate change. But at the same time, China's growing influence and international policies present challenges to our security. And allies are concerned by China's coercive policies, which stand in contrast to the fundamental values enshrined in the North Atlantic Treaty. And in this regard, the sort of questions that your report and your research raises merit all our attention. Second, on climate change, allied leaders agreed for the first time that addressing the security impact of climate change will be an important task for NATO itself. This will include regular assessments of the impact of climate change on our installations, on our missions, and other activities, integrating climate change into our exercises, defense planning and procurement, and developing a methodology for assessing greenhouse gas emissions from our military activities. So these are things that are now on our agenda and have been agreed. And I think that really draws a link back again to your research. And I think, as we pursue the climate transition, what you've been researching in your report is very interesting as well. That potential pitfalls and potential risks that arise from the interaction between this geopolitical competition on the one hand and climate change and climate transition on the other side. And so that brings me to the third issue I'd like to highlight, which is our capacity as an alliance, as a group of nations, to actually innovate and to maintain our technological edge. This is definitely a challenge in the context of the rise of China, but also in the context of tackling climate change. Now, at the summit, again, one of the major decisions that we took as an alliance was that allies are determined to sharpen this technological edge collectively, including by launching for the first time a Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or DIANA for short. At the same time, they will establish a NATO Innovation Fund to invest collectively in startups working on emerging and disruptive technologies. So I venture that many of the questions you raise about access to technology, access to investment, could also in future be thought about in the context of the NATO efforts to sharpen our technological edge. And finally, I'd also like to highlight a fourth dimension of our agenda at NATO, which is strengthening NATO and national resilience. Resilience is our first line of defense, and it underpins our collective ability to defend each other. We increasingly rely on civilian services and infrastructure to effectively operate in peace, crisis, or conflict. And it's key to pushing back on potential adversaries who use military and economic tools to weaken our societies and undermine our security. So we're doing a lot already in bolstering resilience, including by setting minimum standards. But at the summit in June, allied leaders agreed to go further. We approved a new resilience commitment. We will develop NATO-wide resilience objectives, and allies will develop concrete national goals to safeguard our critical infrastructure. This will allow NATO, in turn, to better advise allies in their national resilience efforts in support of our collective defense, and better link resilience with our broader posture and plans. So to loop back to your original question, Ruslan, I think to underline a fundamental point here, our security agenda has become indeed much more complex, has broadened and widened in a variety of ways. And your research definitely demonstrates this. So, for instance, as our work on climate security advances, it'll be important to link it up with our work on resilience, on emerging technologies. But what really I would like to stress in this context, and that goes back to your point about the common political infrastructure that we need to tackle this broad set of security challenges, is the importance of a broad-ranging and robust dialogue within the context of the transatlantic relationship. And that's a key thing, a key plank that the allies themselves agreed to here in Brussels in June, to really broaden and deepen our political consultations here at the Alliance, including on such issues as economic security, new technologies, climate, and the defense of the international rules-based order. So I think all this is very relevant for what we're doing. The final thing I'd obviously mention, and listening also to what the Honourable Mr. Bütikofer said, is the importance of a robust NATO-EU cooperation. We don't have all the tools to tackle all this, but clearly together with the EU, we can really develop a broader, united front to look at these more complex issues together. So I think these issues that you raised today are essential and really will feed into the sort of reflection we're undertaking right now. The final point here I'd like to stress is, of course, that we've also launched work towards a new strategic concept. We'll have to think about how we reflect this complexity of this new security environment, which draws in a whole range of issues as I laid out, as we zero in on our new concept that we will agree next year at our summit in Spain, and really chart the course ahead for NATO to be able to tackle these challenges in the future. So with that, I'll leave it over back to you, Ruslan.
Thank you so much, Ruben, also for keeping it on time. I'd like now to turn to Eric Hons, our last presenter. She's the Deputy Regional Director at the Eurasian Center for International Private Enterprise and a longtime partner for CSD. Eric, it seems that both China and Russia somehow want to use the private sector, to eat the cake and have it at the same time. What we're seeing in Russia, but also very much in China, is that essentially, unlike our system where we have a division between the public or state sector and the private sector, there is no such a thing in China. And you've developed the concept of corrosive capital and constructive capital, and you've looked at it globally. What are your insights in terms of what the private sector, how we could do with the tools of the private sector in limiting the negative impact of this kind of mixture of state and private sector, and that we have in both China and Russia. And of course, this also links to what Reinhard Bütikofer was mentioning on the work of NGOs. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Ruslan, and thanks, Martin, for the excellent report. It's great to be here virtually. Unfortunately, I wish I was in Sofia today, but this is second best, I suppose. And thank you to the two prior panelists who provided some great insights from both the European political perspective and the defense and security perspective. So CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, was founded, much as the German Stiftung were founded, with our other democracy organizations. So my sister institutes include the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, Solidarity Center, and our institute. Our parent is the US Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So wherever I go in the world, I look at things through a private market perspective. And when I look at actors like China and like Russia, I struggle to see exactly where the market is in those countries. When property rights can be canceled at the stroke of a pen, when state interests dominate over private interests, these are no longer typical market economies that we've been dealing with. And although our parliaments and our political institutions may have deemed them, quote unquote, a market economy in many contexts, in fact, they do not run as a market economy. Now, coming from a background in law and looking at the evolution of corporate law over the past 100 or so years, what that is meant in the West is that is there a strong line between the private sector and the public sector and the state, that is, right? In both China and in Russia, this line is obfuscated or blurred to the point where it's no longer quite recognizable. The rule of law becomes a game for the state and an instrument to enforce its views rather than something to be collectively enshrined from the bottom up, as we experienced in most of our democracies. What we work at CIPE is putting this within a constructive and a corrosive capital perspective. On the one hand, we have a corrosive capital perspective where you have investments into a country that are opaque in origin, that are not complying or listening to stakeholders in the country, And lastly, as Martin pointed out, are not necessarily market oriented. Where's the investor return? If Siemens, a great company, wanted to invest in the Western Balkans, it will have to answer to its shareholders that this investment decision provides a greater investment return than any other project in the world. Now, that's not a consideration for a Chinese state enterprise that wants to invest in the Balkans. They partially, in an opportunistic fashion, operate. However, due to their access to capital and access to state resources that are not available to many Western companies, due to a variety of reasons. One being that Western companies don't want to get so entangled into state affairs, that these Chinese companies don't have to pay attention or may have alternative considerations. If they do this project in this particular country, in the Western Balkans, they might have access to other resources internally in China that they also need. And so there's, again, this blurring of the line between the state and the private sector is something that I don't think that our Western institutions, particularly rule of law, have really caught up with in the long term. I think what we're seeing now in the Western Balkans in particular is the 2008 financial crisis catching up with us. In the wake of 2008, investment around the world dried up. Many countries, including those in the Western Balkans, lowered requirements for investment screening, lowered requirements for due diligence into the country, and really were ready to accept just whatever investment was coming in. And we're reaping those investments today. We're seeing undermining and the corrosion of democratic standards and norms. We see an undermining or corrosion of market norms. And really, as the EU begins to kind of think about this in a more comprehensive fashion, I do hope that we can see this as both an offensive and a defensive struggle. From the defensive side, we have mechanisms like investment screening. We have a shared respect and commonality for understanding what represents a private firm versus a state-owned enterprise. We have a common understanding of corporate governance in that field and that respect. And then from the offensive side, I'd like to see what the private sector could do here. The private sector, through its establishment of standards that are multinational, where compliance officers work together from one market to another, where they have to comply with the FCPA from the United States, the UK Bribery Act, France's Bribery Act as well, all within this international scheme to raise standards from the private sector and push the ball forward, irrespective of what the government in the given country does. We're talking about international investments here, and so those international investments have to comply by the norms and standards. And what we need is a race to the top, or a minimum standard, and that can be established through the private sector. In other countries around the world where the rule of law is either weak or unenforced or unenforceable, the private sector has sometimes taken the initiative upon itself, due to its own domestic requirements, to integrate standards and to establish standards in things from cotton production to resource manufacturing. And I think that the West, let's talk broadly here, has the opportunity to set those standards. With Mr. Lutfer's comments about what the EU can do, I do hope that when they're talking about the strategic cross collaboration and engagement with members outside of the EU, they're engaged robustly with the private sector. There are financial institutions that would appreciate being engaged in this process, and they're key to integrating and to bringing in those firms. So if a firm in Belgrade or a firm in Sarajevo wants to list in the Frankfurt market, for example, how can Germany take steps to offer those cross-listing opportunities? How can those barriers be lessened? And how can those companies engage more fully? I do have an experience working in countries like Belarus, and many companies in the private sector there did see the EU as essentially a blanket or an umbrella to protect them from the abuse of the rule of law of the Lukashenko regime. And many companies, not for monetary gain, took on EU partners and wanted to engage with EU partners, not necessarily because they needed a capital, but they wanted the rule of law. So I don't think that we in the West, particularly the private sector, should really underestimate what we have to offer. And end on a high note that, you know, when we look at migration patterns around the world, when we look at capital patterns around the world, where even authoritarian states are investing their money, it comes to us, it comes to the West. It's where property rights are protected. So we have to understand that we have something that authoritarian states like China and Russia want. And we should guard that and protect that because it is something valuable and it's something that's easy to lose. So in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a great point to finish on, and then to go into the discussion. We have 4 minutes. I want to finish on time because all busy schedules, and in Europe it's already the end of the day almost. There is a question for Teo Zoric, who asks about the Block 7 of the thermal power plant in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and what are the options. You know, there seems to be more companies Chinese companies trying to get into that project, and at the same time, what could be the possible consequences of Block 7 project in Bosnia and Herzegovina, while also looking at political situation aspect of this country. I think this is a great example of our report, which you could download. You could look at the chat box, and you could have the link on our webpage and download it. I want to have one last round with 1 minute each from our great panelists today. And I want to start with Reinhard Bütikofer to ask you, looking at this example of the thermal power plants and how China aggressively wants to upend this in the Western Balkans, and looking at their very often this is in conjunction with local political elites eager to win projects, not because they're good for the long-term development of the country, but also because they have some monetary incentives. Question is, how can Europe respond? How can the private sector respond? How can NATO? And Eric's point about having something and then imposing these conditionalities, it's a great question. But if you could look into that, and then I'll have Ruben and Eric respond, and then Martin to finish off. Thank you. And I could also see in the chat that Baba Wang is also providing some interesting ideas from OECD. Thank you for that. But let's start with Reinhard, and please, if you could keep it within a minute. I know there's some great points, and we're going to follow up on that. But now let's finish up with our great panel, Reinhard.
Thank you, Ruslan. Oftentimes, growing Chinese influence goes together with elite capture. And in order to fight back in that regard, we should maybe learn some lessons from the Australians. We should look at their sunshine legislation, which mandates certain transparency rules that make it easier to detect when somebody sells out, and not just on his own, but also sells out national interests. This is something that we should focus on. The European Parliament is through its INGA special committee looking at disinformation and foreign interference. That is a second perspective that we should not forget. Many times the Chinese try to grow their influence through what they call united front activities, where they work behind a screen, but still everything is directed by the CCP. I think we should again insist on transparency and push back and expose sellouts.
Thank you. Ruben?
Apologies, I take some time to unmute. Look, I think these sorts of issues that we're exposing today, I mean, building on Mr. Butikover's points, transparency, exposure, information, these are also things that happen internationally and among nations. And I think this is why it's essential to maintain a robust program of consultation amongst ourselves, amongst our diplomats and decision makers in NATO, in the EU, and other fora, to continue to build awareness and ideally strengthen a common situational analysis of the tactics, the techniques, the policies that China pursues, and to increase our ability to sort of look at things in a more strategic and clear-eyed way. I think that is also a key part of the response, and goes back a little bit to what you were saying, Ruslan, about having a common political framework, a common political infrastructure. The more that we don't look at things such as economics or investment decisions in isolation, but look at them as part of the classic tools and levers of statecraft, and that they reserve a comprehensive analysis from a strategic point of view, from the point of view of our values and our governance norms, the more I think this will be something that will come to light as well. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Eric. Any last comments?
Yeah, I'd say that here's your role for civil society, right? Here is where civil society can play a difference. The countries of the Western Balkans, fought for their sovereignty, and you have a neo-mercantilist power, essentially buying off elites and pushing its state agenda down the throat through elite capture. It's what happened in colonialism. I think that we can all agree that colonialism was a fairly bad idea and not one that's sustainable. And so you look at the economic policies, particularly with pushing these specific investments down through elite capture. That's not a sustainable long-term solution to economic growth, inclusion, and creating more wealth in the Western Balkans and anywhere really.
Thank you so much, Eric. And Martin, one last minute so that we could finish just 5 minutes over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. Well, building upon what Reinhard said earlier, there is a need for a common EU-wide framework for assessing Chinese investment, or for that matter, any third-party investments, especially from authoritarian countries. The EU should develop some clear governance guidelines that nation states, member states, or countries in the Western Balkans can follow when they basically assess whether to join a specific project or sign a specific agreement. And these investments, foreign backed investments, should be in line with EU strategic policies, energy policy, investment policy, trade policy, and they need to comply with minimum rules for competition, public procurement, employment, technical standardization. Until we have a common framework for that, China, Russia, Turkey, they'll be able to take advantage of local captured institutions. So there needs to be a kind of a common mechanism. On another issue that is related to that, the EU recently announced the creation of an anti-money laundering authority. So such kind of a common institutions, common mechanisms to enforce rules in the whole EU would be necessary. So this step was a step in the right direction, and a similar screening mechanism can be used for China and Russia in our region. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martin, and thanks a lot to the whole panel, in particular to Reinhard Bütikofer for joining us and giving this great overview. Let me finish by going back to Eric's idea about the West or EU's leverage. We need to use that. Our feeling, and in particular our report, shows that there will be a showdown in the Western Balkans. China will keep pushing there, and how the EU in particular would respond, how we'll find a way to work with our democracy action plan, with our climate and green agenda, and whether we're able to stand up to that pressure that will make a lot of difference. And we very much look forward to working with all of you, with the European Parliament, with our international partners from Center for International Private Enterprise, with NATO, and also with our partners from the Western Balkans. Thank you so much for being with us today. We look forward to hopefully meeting you soon in person in Europe and elsewhere. Thank you again. You can again, please download the report from our website, and there will be a link also to this panel on CSD's YouTube channel. We'll make sure to distribute it to the participants. Thank you so much again. Have a good evening or the good rest of the day if you're in the US. We look forward to welcoming you again to CSD. Thank you so much.
Thank you.